Elias Cole always made coffee for two. It was a ritual unchanged in his 3 years of solitude. There was the rough tin cup for himself, and the white porcelain one with a tiny chip on the rim her cup. He never touched it, just let it sit as a silent witness on the shelf. The rest of the coffee in the pot would simply go cold, a quiet vow he kept to a ghost. But on this September morning, the sky held a heavy leaden color, and the wind whistling past the log walls made the solitude feel sharper than ever. The silence was no longer an old friend, but a burden. And the second cup, more than ever, seemed to be waiting for a story. Elias Cole leaned low against the driving rain. His world shrunk to the space between his mare's ears. The wind lashed at his oilskin duster, seeking the last of his warmth. Beneath him, the bay mare wrestled with every step, her hooves churning. In the slick, grasping mud of the trail. He should have been in his cabin hours ago, but the herd had scattered, and the thought of leaving them to the wolves or to the coming winter was a weight he couldn't abide. He drew the mare to a halt, her sides heaving. It wasn't the wind. A different sound had cut through the storm's howl, thin, lost, and unmistakably human. Elias strained to listen, wheeling the horse toward the sound, a faint cry that the gale nearly devoured. "Hello?" he shouted, his own voice hoarse. "Anyone there?" A jagged seam of lightning ripped the dark, illuminating the landscape in a stark, momentary photograph. And he saw her. A shape folded into itself against a fallen aspen, soaked and nearly motionless. He was off the horse in a single fluid motion, his boots sinking into the soft earth. As he knelt beside her, she looked up. Her eyes were wide, filled with a raw terror and an exhaustion that ran bone deep. "Don't," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. A violent tremor racked her body. "I mean you no harm, ma'am," Elias said, his voice low and even, the kind you use on a spooked animal. "But the cold will take you if you stay here." He didn't wait for a reply. He shrugged out of his heavy duster, the sudden chill a sharp bite against his own skin, and draped it over her trembling shoulders. When he lifted her, he was struck by her startling lightness. He settled her in the saddle, then swung up behind her. The ride back was a slow, heavy affair. The woman in his arms said nothing, just leaned into his chest, making herself small as if trying to vanish from the world entirely dotted the cabin. He shouldered the door open and carried her inside, into the dry, pine-scented dark. He gently set her down on the simple cot near the cold hearth. A match struck, and the lantern flared to life, casting a steady, golden glow. He turned to her, his movements deliberate. "First things first," he said quietly. "We'll chase the chill out." The kindling caught, and a small flame wavered before growing into a steady, hungry fire that began to push back the damp chill from the room's corners. Elias took a dry wool blanket from a chest at the foot of his bed and held it out to her. She watched him for a long, unblinking moment before taking it, her fingers brushing his, cold as river stones. She wrapped the heavy fabric around her shoulders, a small fortress against the night. "I'm Elias Cole," he said, his voice low as he offered her a tin cup of water from the bucket. "Have you a name, ma'am?" She hesitated, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames as if they held a history she was reluctant to leave. "Clara," she said, the name barely a sound. "Clara Reed." "Where were you bound, Mrs. Reed?" She looked down into the cup, at her own wavering reflection. "Nowhere," she admitted. "I was running ... from nothing left." Her hands tightened on the warm tin. "My husband, he passed in the spring, the farm. The bank held the paper on it. They gave me till the first snow." She took a ragged breath. "The snow came early." He studied the fine lines of exhaustion around her eyes, the proud set of her jaw beneath the grime and grief, a sorrow that was too old for a face so young. "So, you're on your own now." She gave a single sharp nod, a gesture that held back a flood. "I have no one." Elias leaned back against the rough-hewn wall, a familiar ache pulling at his own chest. "You do tonight." Her eyes, shadowed and wary, lifted to his. "Why?" "Because this isn't the kind of country that lets a soul die alone in the mud if a hand can be offered." He saw her lip tremble and looked away, giving her the dignity of a moment's privacy. He moved to the stove, his motions practical. "I'll make a skillet of cornbread. It's not much, but it's warm." She didn't reply, but he took her silence as assent. They ate with the storm still rattling the window panes, the only sounds the scrape of forks on tin and the crackle of the fire. Afterwards, she sat on the cot, curled inside the blanket, while he took a spare pallet across the room, leaving a wide river of floorboard between them. "Mr. Cole," her voice came from the shadows. "Why are you here? All alone?" He lay with his hands behind his head, staring up at the dark rafters. "There's a quiet you can't find in town," he said, the words coming slow. "The fever took my wife and our boy 3 years ago now, this place. It asks for nothing but work." "I'm sorry," she whispered. He nodded once into the darkness. "Me too." A long silence fell, and he thought she'd drifted to sleep. But then, so soft he almost missed it, he heard her say, "Thank you for stopping." He didn't answer right away, just watched the firelight paint moving shapes on the ceiling. He hadn't known how hollow the silence in this cabin was until she had filled a small corner of it. Outside, the wind began to lose its fury, the thunder rumbling off toward the eastern plains. By morning, the storm had wept itself out, leaving the world washed clean and draped in a low-hanging mist. Elias stepped out into the crisp air to tend to the mare. When he returned, a thread of smoke was rising from the stove. Clara stood near it, her back to him. She had coaxed the embers from the night's fire back into a low flame and had found the skillet. The smell of frying salt pork filled the small cabin. "You didn't have to do that," he said, setting a fresh armload of wood by the hearth. "I know," she replied, not turning, "but I took the warmth of your fire." Seemed a fair trade. He saw then that she was a person who understood the currency of effort, the balance of giving and taking. After they ate, he stood on the porch, looking out at the gray, silent world. "That fence I was mending yesterday, it still needs doing." "I can help," she said, coming to stand beside him. "I know the work." He looked at her, at the worn boots she'd set by the fire to dry, at her capable hands, now clean but chapped from the cold. He gave a slight nod. "You can ride?" "Not gracefully," she said, "but I stay on." They worked through the morning, the damp air smelling of pine and wet earth. She took the weight of a fallen post without a word while he levered it back into place. She didn't shy from the mud that stained her skirt hem or the strain of pulling. The wire taut. He saw in the set of her shoulders a strength that had been bent, but not broken. As they rode back in the fading light of the afternoon, the quiet that settled between them was different. It was no longer the silence of strangers, but the shared space of two people who had begun, without plan or permission, to rely on the ground the other stood upon. The frost clung to the window glass like fine lace in the mornings that followed. Elias would step out into the pre-dawn chill, his breath pluming in the air, and return to find Clara already awake, a quiet presence by the hearth. One morning, he came in from hauling oats to see her at the small table, a piece of butcher's paper spread before her, a stub of a pencil in her hand. "Didn't hear you rise," he said, setting his gloves on the stove rail to dry. "The floorboards in this cabin hold their secrets close," she replied, not looking up from her work. He poured water into the basin to wash and glanced over her shoulder. She was sketching lines and squares, a map of a place that was. "Fence lines," she explained, tapping a corner of the paper with a fingernail. "Our old pasture. I thought if I drew it, I could hold on to the memory of it a little longer." The way the land fell toward the creek. Elias didn't speak right away. He filled the coffee pot and set it on the stove before taking the chair opposite her. "You aim to have land again?" "I don't know what I'd do with it," she said, her voice low, "but I don't like the thought of forgetting how it felt to belong somewhere." He leaned back, the old chair groaning in protest. "There's a hollow past the second ridge, sits empty. Belongs to no one but the government and the winter wind. If a person was willing to fight the rock and the cold for it." Her pencil stilled. "I've fought worse," she said simply. He gave a short nod. "When the sun is higher, perhaps you'd take a walk with me and see it." She folded the paper carefully and tucked it away. "I'd like that." They climbed the slope on foot after their morning meal, the ground soft beneath their boots. Elias led the way, pointing out a game trail or the place where the snowdrifts lay deepest in winter. When they crested the ridge, a long sheltered valley stretched below them, rimmed with pine and bathed in the gold of the morning sun. A creek cut a silver ribbon through its center. "I didn't expect," she began, her voice trailing off, so open. "Most folks look for easier ground," Elias said. She crouched down, brushing her hand over a clump of wild bunchgrass. "It's good soil," she murmured, almost to herself. "It has a different feel when it's been left to its own counsel for a while." She crumbled a bit of earth between her fingers. "It remembers kindness." He watched her, a woman who spoke the land's language. They spent the better part of the day walking the perimeter, her questions practical about water, wind, and where the sun hit longest. At the far end, they sat on a fallen log, sharing a strip of dried venison from his coat pocket. It's USBAND. He liked things settled, she said, her gaze on a hawk circling in the vast blue above. He believed if you built your fences strong enough, nothing bad could get in. He was a good man, but he didn't understand that some troubles don't bother with fences. She looked at Elias. "I don't miss the noise of a life, but I miss the steadiness. Just knowing another soul is breathing under the same roof." "Steadiness matters," Elias agreed, "more than most folks admit." "Some men make promises like they're tossing pebbles in a river," she said, her eyes clear and direct on his. "They make a splash and they're gone. Others lay them down like foundation stones. You seem the second kind." "I don't lay many," he said, "but the ones I do, I mean for them to hold." They returned to the cabin as the sky began to blush with evening. That night, a comfortable quiet settled between them as he mended a strap on his saddlebag, and she sat by the fire, her hands resting in her lap. "Do you think a person is meant to stay alone?" she asked, breaking the silence. "After they've lost someone?" He worked the awl through the thick leather, his movements measured. "I think some folks find their way back," he said finally. "But the path isn't the same one they left. The loss, it changes the landscape." She watched the fire for a long time. "And if you can't find the new path? Then you stay lost a bit longer," he said. "But maybe not forever." He set his tools aside. Her gaze met his across the quiet room. "Would it trouble you much, Mr. Cole, if I stayed a while longer?" "No, Clara," he said, his voice quiet and sure. "It wouldn't trouble me at all." He saw the tension in her shoulders ease, just slightly, as if for the first time since he'd found her in the storm, she had finally allowed herself to believe the ground beneath her feet might just hold. The last of the snows receded into the high country, and the creek swelled with meltwater, its voice a constant, cheerful murmur. The air, once sharp with frost, now carried the rich, dark scent of thawed earth. Life was returning to the hollows. Elias watched from the cabin steps as Clara worked in a small patch of ground she had cleared near the porch. Sleeves rolled high, skirt hemmed with mud. She was marking straight rows in the soil with a sharpened stick, her focus absolute. He walked over, a small sack of seed corn resting on his hip. "You have a straight eye," he observed. She glanced up, brushing a stray wisp of hair from her face with the back of her wrist. "My father used to tie string between stakes," she said. He believed in tools. I learned to trust my hands. Mind if I walk the row with you? He asked. She handed him the stick. Let's see if your boots are as steady as your talk. They fell into an easy rhythm, she marking the line, he following to press a seed into the earth with his thumb, firming the soil over it with his boot heel. The sun climbed higher, warming their backs. That hollow you showed me, she said after a long, comfortable silence. I was thinking a lean-to against the north slope would see it through the winter. Elias paused, dusting the soil from his hands. Is that a thought or a plan? I don't make plans I haven't thought through, she answered. He stood up, looking. From her to the line they had made together in the earth. If you're meaning to stay, Clara, he said, his voice even, then it's not a thing you'll be building alone. Her hands stilled. She looked at him, then down at the shared work, and gave a small nod. Then we plant, he said, handing her the sack. Later, they knelt by the creek, washing the good dirt from their hands in the cold, rushing water. He sat back on his heels, watching the way the current played over her fingers. I never asked, he said quietly, what you would have done if I hadn't come along that day. She let the water fall from her cupped palms, her gaze distant. I would have walked till my feet gave out, she said, her voice devoid of pity. And then I would have found a tree to sit under, and I would have stopped. She met his eyes. I don't give up easy, Mr. Cole, but I was close. The wind whispered through the willows that lined the bank. You've found something steadier now? He asked. I think, she said, turning to him. I found someone who knows how to listen to the quiet. He held her gaze, the truth of her words settling. Somewhere deep inside him. That wasn't a thing he'd ever set out to be, but she saw it in him all the same. It's still what you are, she added, with a faint, true smile. That evening, the cabin was filled with the scent of baking bread. The quiet between them felt different now, no longer a space to be carefully navigated, but a foundation on which things were being built. He watched her move about the hearth, her motions sure and settled. The woman he had carried out of the storm was gone, replaced by this one, whose strength was a quiet, steady flame. Clara, he began, his voice rougher than he intended. He cleared his throat. That hollow we walked. The land, it's yours, if you want the deed to it. She turned, her expression unreadable in the firelight. And you, Elias, what would you keep? He glanced around the small, warm cabin that had been only his for so long. The rest of this ridge, he said. And a place at my table, if you've a mind to take it. She didn't answer right away. The wind sighed outside, a lonely sound. Then she stepped toward him, slow and deliberate, until the space between them was gone. Her hand, chapped from work but steady, reached for his. He felt her fingers intertwine with his, callus to callus. I won't run again, Elias, she said, her voice low and sure. He looked down at their joined hands, a bond forged not of words, but of shared labor and quiet understanding. You don't have to, he said. They stood for a long moment under the vast Wyoming sky, their hands joined between them, a silent promise laid down, stronger than any words. That night, the fire in the hearth burned low and steady. He sat in his usual chair, and she pulled. Another close, the space between them now a shared comfort, not a divide. He was smoothing a new handle for an axe, the wood shavings falling at his feet. She was mending a tear in the canvas of his duster, her stitches small and even. I'd like to raise chickens again, she said into the quiet, her eyes on her work. Not for profit, just for the steadiness of hearing them in the morning. I'll build you a co-op, Elias said, not pausing in his work. A proper one, against the south wall of the barn. And a small garden fence, she added, to keep them out of the vegetables. I've got seeds put by, he replied. I'll dig the trench. She smiled, a faint, lovely thing that creased the corners of her eyes. You always answer so, no hesitation. I know what I want, Clara. She set her sewing in her lap and turned to him. Fully, then say it. He put the axe handle down and reached for her free hand, his calloused palm warm against hers. I want this, he said, his voice quiet but for the first time stripped of all its shadows. Shared work, quiet nights, a roof we both belong under. He looked at her, his gaze clear and long. A life built to last. Whatever she had been holding back, whatever last defense she had maintained, finally softened and fell away. Then it's yours, she whispered. I'm yours. They were married 2 weeks later, with no witness but the sky and the ancient cottonwood that stood by the creek, the one whose roots held firm and whose leaves drank from water that never ran dry. Elias carved 2 rings from a piece of shed, elk antler, polishing them smooth with his own hands. She wore hers on a leather cord around her neck, close to her skin. He wore his on the little finger of his left hand and never took it off. Over that first summer, the garden grew in neat, thriving rows, and the small coop he built was soon filled with hens that clucked and scratched as if they had known no other home. By fall, the corn stood tall, and the scent of canning spice and wood smoke hung in the air. They moved through their days in an easy rhythm, a language of shared glances and understood silence. They did not need to explain why he reached for her hand as they walked back from the barn at dusk. When winter came again, it was a different season entirely. It came not as a threat, but as a reason to draw closer. They sat by the fire on the long dark nights, her head often resting against his shoulder, his thumb tracing the delicate bones of her wrist. They never spoke the word love, as if the thing itself was too large and sacred for a single word. They lived it instead, in each shared cup of coffee at dawn, in each quiet look across a field, in the simple, profound choice to fall asleep and wake side by side. Their pasts remained, as all pasts do, but they were Nollinger's sharp-edged sorrows. They were stories softened by time and the patient, steady grace of new days. Together, they had built something neither had dared to hope for, a home that held fast through every season, a bond that never asked for more than what was freely given, and it held. Long after the last fence was mended and the last seed was sown, it held because they had made it so, with hands worn by work and hearts made gentle by trust. And in that quiet corner of Wyoming, where the wind once howled with a grief they both understood, and now only whispered through the pines, Elias and Clara lived out their days in peace, side by side, never once alone again.